They stole my family's land with a rusted train blockade, but the HOA president never guessed my grandfather buried a nuclear clause in its steel bones. One signature. That's all it took to erase their entire kingdom. I'm Tommy Everett, and this is how I dismantled a corrupt HOA using a secret hidden in the locomotive that started our war. What we found in that train will make you rethink every property dispute you've ever heard. Your family legacy is now our property, she smiled, while an entire locomotive blocked the only entrance to my grandfather's land. The massive rusted train had appeared overnight, strategically positioned across my access road. HOA President Deborah Harrison stood beside it, triumphantly waving a boundary map in my face. She smiled like a chess player who'd already won, but the board wasn't hers to control. This is HOA territory now, she declared, her voice dripping with authority. Accept it or face the consequences. If only she knew that same abandoned train would become the key to her downfall. Hidden within that locomotive was a secret my grandfather left behind, one that would obliterate her precious HOA and everything she'd built. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below as I reveal how one forgotten signature turned this power-hungry HOA's greatest weapon into their ultimate destruction. I never thought I'd be fighting a war over a piece of land that had been in my family since the 1950s. The property was special to me, 5 acres of beautiful countryside just outside the expanding Sunny Hills subdivision, with old oak trees and a small creek running through it. My grandfather, a retired railroad engineer, had left it to me in his will 2 years ago. It was the perfect place to build my dream home, especially after losing my wife in an accident. I needed a fresh start, not just for me, but for the future she'd been robbed of. The property represented more than just land to me. It was a connection to my family's heritage and a chance to honor my grandfather's memory. Every weekend for months, I'd been clearing brush, marking out the foundation, and planning where each room of my future home would be. I'd already invested thousands of dollars in architectural plans and permits from the county. The trouble began on a crisp autumn morning when I found an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. Notice of violation, it read in bold red letters. According to the Sunny Hills Homeowners Association, I was to cease all construction activity immediately on HOA property. I was confused. My land wasn't part of any HOA. I'd checked the property records thoroughly before starting my building plans. The next day, I drove out to the property to find something that made my blood boil. They had placed an entire abandoned train across the only access road to my land. It was positioned perfectly to block any construction equipment from entering. The rusty metal beast stretched nearly 100 yards, its faded paint still showing hints of the blue and silver livery of the old Western Pacific Line. I recognized it immediately as an EMD FP7 locomotive, the same model my grandfather had operated for 25 years. As I stared at the rusted underbelly, I noticed my grandfather's initials gleaming on a small metal plate. They'd chosen the wrong battleground. Standing beside the rusty locomotive was Deborah Harrison, the HOA president, a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled hair and a permanent look of disapproval. Next to her was William Porter, their retired lawyer who now served on the board. Mr. Everett, Deborah said with a plastic smile, I see you've received our notice. This property falls within Sunny Hills boundaries according to our county-approved administrative map. She unfurled a large map showing my property highlighted as Community Amenities Area. William nodded along, adding, any construction requires HOA approval, which you haven't received. You're accruing fines of $250 per day until this matter is resolved. I noticed how William's eyes never quite met mine, shifting away whenever I tried to make direct contact. His fingers tapped nervously against his leather portfolio, a tell that suggested he wasn't entirely confident in their position. I tried reasoning with them, showing my deed and property records, but they dismissed them as outdated. Deborah's smile never wavered as she explained how the HOA had administrative authority over all structures within the community's boundaries. Her voice carried that special tone that only comes from years of believing you're always right. You see, Mr. Everett, she continued, gesturing around us with manicured hands, Sunny Hills has a particular aesthetic standard to maintain. We simply can't have unauthorized construction disrupting the harmony of our community. I left feeling helpless and angry, but I wasn't about to give up land that had been in my family for generations. That evening, I called Franklin Guthrie, my grandfather's old colleague from the railroad company. If anyone knew the history of this land, it would be him. Franklin met me at a small coffee shop downtown. At 70, he still had the sharp eyes of a man who'd spent decades ensuring trains ran safely. The moment I mentioned the train blocking my property, his weathered face creased with concern. They're using engine 446, your grandfather's old locomotive. He shook his head in disbelief. That map Deborah showed you, he said after I explained the situation, it was modified from a 1985 draft without state approval. I remember when they tried to pull something similar 20 years ago with the Johnson's Orchard. Same tactics, suddenly claiming land that had never been part of their development. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Your grandfather was smarter than they give him credit for. He knew someday someone might try to take that land. He had a sixth sense about these things, always planning 3 steps ahead. As we parted, Franklin handed me an old brass key and a yellowed map. This opens the railroad archive storage room. If you want to fight them, you'll need what's inside. The key was heavy in my palm, worn smooth from years of use, with a small tag attached reading Western Pacific Records, Section 8. Granddad's last words? Franklin added, if they ever come for this land, check engine 446. I left a fight in there. That night, I pored over my grandfather's old documents. Among them was a complex transaction record from 1953 involving the land and the railroad tracks that ran along its edge. The technical language was difficult to parse, with references to right-of-ways, assignments, and permanent easement limitations that would require an expert to fully interpret. I also found a photograph of my grandfather standing proudly next to the very same locomotive that now blocked my property, his hand resting on it like an old friend. In the background, I could make out the oak trees that still stood on my land, though they were much smaller then. I remembered the last time we inspected the tracks together when I was just 12. We had walked the entire perimeter, him pointing out property markers and telling stories about the trains that used to run through. This land isn't just dirt and trees, Tommy, he'd said. It's freedom. Remember that. I hadn't understood what he meant at the time. Now, with someone trying to take it away, his words took on new meaning. Franklin's parting words echoed in my mind. Your grandfather once told me, if someone ever tries to mess with my grandson, tell him to look at that contract. It doesn't just protect the land, it protects freedom itself. I didn't understand what he meant yet, but I was determined to find out. As I continued searching through the documents, I found a folder marked Agreement Contingencies filled with legal papers that seemed to outline specific conditions for the development of the Sunny Hills neighborhood. The language was dense with legal terminology, but one phrase jumped out. Perpetual ownership of trackage rights remains with grantor regardless of future development. My grandfather had left me not just a piece of land, but a ticking legal time bomb that Deborah Harrison couldn't possibly anticipate. The documents inside could end this war or start a bigger one. The next morning, I decided to learn more about what I was up against. Sunny Hills was an upscale subdivision with about 300 homes, manicured lawns, and strict rules about everything from mailbox designs to the acceptable shade of beige for exterior paint. The community itself was only about 25 years old, built during the housing boom of the late 1990s, but it carried itself with the pretension of old money. As I drove through the neighborhood, I noticed how uniform everything looked, identical setbacks from the street, similar landscaping patterns, and a distinct lack of personal expression. Even the holiday decorations seemed regulated, with tasteful wreaths all hanging at precisely the same height. I parked my truck near the community center and started talking to residents, introducing myself as the owner of the property by the old railroad tracks. Most people were friendly enough, though some grew uncomfortable when I mentioned the HOA dispute. That's how I met Olivia Bennett, a local journalist in her late 30s with a no-nonsense attitude and a notebook always in hand. She was photographing the community bulletin board when she overheard me talking to an elderly couple about my situation. The train blockade, she said when I mentioned my situation. I've been wanting to cover that story, but Deborah threatened to sue our paper if we printed anything. She had the intense focus of someone who'd spent years digging for hidden truths, and I could tell immediately she might be a valuable ally. We grabbed lunch at a nearby diner where Olivia shared stories about Deborah's reign of terror. Elderly residents fined for having flower pots the wrong color, families harassed for children's toys visible in driveways, and arbitrary rule changes implemented without proper voting procedures. Last year, she fined a war veteran $500 for putting up a flagpole without permission, Olivia said. When he refused to pay, they put a lien on his house. The poor man had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, came home with a Purple Heart, and couldn't even fly the flag he'd fought for. It's disgraceful. As we talked, Olivia pulled out her laptop and showed me years of records she'd collected about Sunny Hills HOA's questionable practices, pages upon pages of complaints, board meeting minutes with suspicious redactions, and financial records showing unexplained administrative fees that had steadily increased year after year. There's a pattern here, she pointed out, scrolling through a spreadsheet of property acquisitions. Whenever they want a piece of property, they suddenly discover it was always part of the HOA territory. 3 small property owners before you face the same issue. They eventually signed away their rights because they couldn't afford to fight. The screen showed a satellite view of the neighborhood with red markers indicating properties that had been incorporated through questionable means. My land was marked with a yellow star labeled Project Railroad Corridor. She paused, studying my reaction. Did you know Deborah has a personal history with property disputes? Her father was a landowner who lost everything in a bank foreclosure when she was 15. Their family farm was seized while they watched helplessly. She swore she'd never be powerless again. Now she collects properties like trophies, and control is her way of ensuring she's never vulnerable again. The revelation added a layer of understanding, though not sympathy, to Deborah's ruthless tactics. It explained her obsession with expanding HOA territory and accumulating power. She's built her entire identity around never being the victim again, Olivia explained. But in the process, she's become exactly what destroyed her family, someone who takes what others have built. The next day, I found a document left in my mailbox. A preliminary purchase agreement with the HOA logo, but no signatures. It offered to buy my land for 40% below market value with a handwritten note. This would make all those pesky fines disappear. The document was carefully worded to appear casual, but I noticed several clauses in the fine print that would grant the HOA immediate access to begin improvements on the property even before the sale was finalized. There was also a non-disclosure agreement buried on page 4 that would prevent me from discussing the terms with anyone, including legal counsel. I called William Porter to decline the offer, but he wasn't interested in negotiation. You don't understand what you're up against, he said coolly. The HOA has resources you can't match. We're prepared for a long fight, are you? And considering your recent incident with our security personnel, you might want to consider whether protracted legal proceedings are in your best interest. His voice carried the practiced menace of someone accustomed to making problems disappear through intimidation. After hanging up, I noticed an elderly resident watching me from his porch across the street. He gestured for me to come over, glancing nervously at his neighbor's windows. They used to have signs, he said cryptically, his voice barely above a whisper. No building allowed on that stretch years ago, before they changed the maps. Those tracks meant something once. I continued my investigation, digging through county records and talking to more residents. Each conversation revealed new aspects of Deborah's tactics, how she would selectively enforce rules against those who opposed her while ignoring violations by her allies. One resident showed me before and after photos of their backyard pond that they'd been forced to fill in, while a board member across the street had an identical water feature that was never questioned. I discovered that William Porter, despite being retired, still maintained connections with several judges in the county court system, connections that might explain why previous challenges to the HOA had mysteriously stalled in court. Olivia discovered that the HOA had quietly expanded its boundaries 3 times in the past decade, each time without following proper procedures for amending covenants. The most recent expansion, just 2 years earlier, had incorporated a strip of land that conveniently included the access road to my property. By evening, I received another notice. The HOA was now fining me $250 per day, retroactive to when I inherited the property. The total already exceeded $20,000. They're trying to bury you in debt, Olivia warned as we reviewed the notice over coffee. It's their standard playbook. They'll keep adding fines until you have no choice but to sell. The fines piled up like hospital bills, and I wondered if my wife would forgive me for almost giving up. Franklin called with another piece of information that ignited a spark of hope. His voice trembled with excitement as he shared what he'd remembered during his own investigation. The locomotive blocking your land, engine 446. Your grandfather modified it himself back in '68. He installed a special technical compartment in it to hide proprietary engineering diagrams during the corporate espionage scare. Not many people know about it. We used to joke that your grandfather could smuggle a filing cabinet through a train inspection without anyone noticing. The revelation fit perfectly with memories of my grandfather showing me secret places on trains when I was young, hidden panels and compartments that railroad workers used to store personal items during long hauls. The compartment should be on the engineer's side, behind a panel with his initials stamped into the metal. If he left anything important behind, that's where it would be. The call ended with Franklin promising to dig through his own records for anything else that might help. I stayed up late that night, spreading documents across my living room floor, connecting pieces of this puzzle, property surveys, historical photos, zoning records. I was building a case piece by piece. As I worked, I realized this wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about all the people Deborah had bullied over the years, the veteran who couldn't fly his flag, the elderly woman fined for having the wrong color roses, the family forced to remove their disabled son's basketball hoop because it was 6 inches too tall. I needed evidence of the HOA's deception, and I knew exactly where to start looking for it. The old locomotive wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was potentially the key to bringing down Deborah's house of cards. Deborah thought she buried me under steel. She didn't know I'd dig up a weapon. First thing tomorrow, I promised myself I'm going to find out exactly what my grandfather left in that train. I set my alarm for 5 o'clock in the morning, determined to reach the train before the security guard arrived for his shift at 7 o'clock. This battle was about to move from paperwork to action. The county archives building was a bland concrete structure downtown, but to me, it represented hope. Franklin met me there the following morning, his old railroad employee badge still granting us access to the special collections room. As we signed in, I noticed a man in a suit quickly looking away and pretending to read a newspaper. Franklin saw him too, whispering, "That's Roger Davis, Deborah's cousin. Works in commercial real estate. They're already a step ahead of us." We hurried into the records room where the smell of old paper and dust filled the air. "We need to move quickly," Franklin said tensely. "Railroad land grants and property transfers from before the 1970s are all still on paper. I know exactly which section to check." He moved with purpose through the labyrinth of file cabinets, occasionally glancing over his shoulder at the door. "Your grandfather told me if anyone ever questioned the land boundaries, the answers would be in Section 8, Cabinet 12. Within an hour, we hit the jackpot. a comprehensive file containing the original 1953 contract complete with survey maps and deed transfers. I photographed everything with my phone, hands trembling with excitement. But the real shock came when Franklin pulled out a large registry book. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a line item showing my grandfather had purchased not just the land, but actual ownership of the railroad track section that ran alongside it. More surprising still was what Franklin discovered on the next page. The entire Sunny Hills development had been built on land originally owned by the railroad company, with the HOA only holding long-term leasing rights based on a complex agreement my grandfather had helped draft. "Your grandfather was the railroad's property manager before he became an engineer," Franklin explained, showing me a staff photo. "He structured this deal carefully because he knew land developers were already circling. He wanted to make sure his descendants would always have leverage against any future land grabs." We heard footsteps approaching and quickly returned the documents to their proper places. As we exited, Roger Davis was on his phone speaking in hushed tones. Our secret was out. Deborah would soon know we were building our case. The next morning, I met with Jennifer Dawson, a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. Her office walls displayed framed news articles about successful fights against corporate developers. "I've been wanting to take on Deborah Harrison for years," she confided. "3 of my clients have been bullied into submission by that woman." When she examined our findings, her eyes widened. "This changes everything, Mr. Everett. These documents establish that not only does the railroad track belong to your family, but technically the Sunny Hills HOA exists on land that your family has ultimate jurisdiction over. They're just long-term tenants." She turned to a specific clause in the contract, and according to this, there appeared to be specific conditions that could potentially invalidate the entire arrangement. Word of my investigation must have reached Deborah quickly. When I returned to my property that afternoon, I found the access point had new locks and 2 private security guards posted by the train. One blocked my path while the other filmed from a distance. "No trespassing," the first guard said flatly. "HOA regulations." When I tried to walk around him to access my property from another angle, he physically blocked me. I noticed the second guard was carefully positioning his camera to capture only my reactions, not his colleagues' provocations. That evening, chaos erupted. Olivia called me frantically. "Thomas, they're showing edited footage of you, assaulting their security guard all over the community forum. They've filed a police report." But she had surprising news of her own. I have a source who was there. Mrs. Patel from the corner house was walking her dog and saw the whole thing. She secretly recorded it on her phone. The unedited version completely contradicts their story. Mrs. Patel, a retired high school teacher who had her own grievances with the HOA, had live-streamed the entire interaction to her social media account. Her footage clearly showed the guard deliberately blocking me and even shoving me when I tried to pass. The community's reaction was split. Deborah's supporters still condemned me, but others were beginning to question the HOA's tactics. The escalation continued when my primary contractor called the next morning to withdraw from my building project. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Everett," he said, his voice strained. "Someone contacted my wife at her workplace yesterday. They mentioned our kids by name and which schools they attend. Said it would be unfortunate if we got caught up in a legal mess. I can't risk my family." 2 other contractors followed suit, citing similar veiled threats. William Porter had escalated beyond legal intimidation to something far more sinister. Jennifer helped me file for an emergency injunction against the HOA, but damage to my finances and reputation was mounting. I also learned that William had submitted falsified documents to the IRS, triggering an audit of my personal finances. "This is how they operate," Jennifer explained. "They try to make fighting so costly, financially, emotionally, socially, that giving up seems like the only option." The pressure was mounting, and doubts began to creep in. That night, sitting alone in my apartment looking at old photographs, I felt the weight of it all crushing down. A stack of legal bills sat on my kitchen table next to the latest HOA violation notice, which now included charges for security personnel necessitated by homeowner aggression. But then I noticed something in a picture of my grandfather standing beside the locomotive. He was pointing to a specific section of the engine, a proud smile on his face. I remembered Franklin's words about a hidden compartment. I needed to examine that train immediately. I knew getting past the guards wouldn't be easy. They've been doubled since our confrontation, with patrols throughout the night, but I had to try. Whatever my grandfather had hidden in that train might be the key to ending this fight once and for all. The next morning, I sent an official letter to the Sunny Hills HOA board, formally notifying them of my ownership of both the land and the railroad tracks, citing the documentation I'd discovered. The letter was printed on professional letterhead that Jennifer had provided, with copies of the most damning historical documents attached as exhibits. Each page was carefully tabbed and labeled for maximum impact. I requested immediate removal of the train, blocking my access and cessation of all fines, giving them 72 hours to respond before we would pursue all available legal remedies. Jennifer helped me draft the language to sound as authoritative as possible, adding phrases like willful deprivation of property rights and potential liability for damages and legal costs. This puts them on legal notice, she explained as we reviewed the final draft in her office. If they continue to block your access after this, we have grounds for additional claims, including harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Courts take a dim view of parties who ignore formal legal notices. Rather than trust the Postal Service, I hand-delivered copies to each board member's home, taking photos as evidence of delivery. Most accepted the envelopes with confused expressions, but Deborah's face turned a dangerous shade of red when she opened her door to find me standing there. She snatched the envelope without a word and slammed the door in my face, the sound echoing through her perfectly landscaped front yard. The HOA's threats turned desperate. But desperation makes mistakes, and I had a pen ready. The HOA's response came swiftly. That evening, they held an emergency board meeting and voted to cut off electrical service to the area surrounding my property, claiming safety concerns due to unauthorized construction activities. The vote was taken without public notice, in violation of their own bylaws requiring at least 48 hours posted notice for any emergency session. I discovered this the next day when I arrived with an electrician to discuss power hookups for my future home. The utility company informed me that the HOA had filed paperwork claiming jurisdiction over the service area and that I would need HOA approval before any connections could be established. I've never seen anything like this, the confused utility worker told me. Usually service requests only get blocked for non-payment or safety hazards. This whole jurisdiction claim is above my pay grade. He seemed genuinely sympathetic, suggesting I contact the Public Utilities Commission to challenge the ruling. William was escalating his tactics, too. He contacted the bank holding my construction loan, raising questions about the disputed property status. He had apparently sent them copies of the HOA violation notices and police report about the security guard incident, carefully edited to make me appear unreasonable and potentially violent. Within hours, my loan officer called to inform me that my funding was temporarily suspended pending resolution of ownership issues. His voice carried an apologetic tone, but company policy was clear. They couldn't continue funding a project with unclear title status. Without that financing, my construction plans would grind to a halt, even if I regained access to the property. The financial strategy was clear: cut off both my physical access and my financial resources, leaving me unable to develop the property while legal costs continued to mount. It was a classic war of attrition. They're trying to starve you out financially, Jennifer warned when I called her with the news. This is classic legal warfare. Cut off resources until you can't afford to keep fighting. Deborah knows exactly which pressure points to target. Her voice hardened with determination. We need to respond in kind. Tomorrow morning, we'll file for an emergency hearing on the access issue. And I'm adding a request for damages related to loan interference. In the meantime, let's try to find out where that board meeting was held. If it violated open meeting laws, we can potentially void all decisions made there. While Jennifer worked on the legal front, Olivia helped me connect with other residents who had faced similar bullying from Deborah's administration. We began meeting quietly at a cafe outside the subdivision, sharing stories and strategies. Many were hesitant at first, fearful of retaliation. But as they heard about the documents I'd found, hope began to replace resignation in their eyes. One former board member who had resigned in protest of Deborah's tactics 18 months earlier provided internal emails showing the HO had been systematically targeting properties they wanted to acquire. His name was Gerald Matt, a retired civil engineer who had initially joined the board hoping to improve community infrastructure. Deborah runs that place like her personal fiefdom, he explained, sliding a flash drive across the table. Everything has to go through her. When I questioned the property acquisition strategy, suggesting we focus on road repairs instead, I suddenly found myself facing violation notices for my non-conforming garden shed, a shed that had been there for 8 years without issue. The flash drive contained dozens of emails, meeting minutes, and budget documents from his time on the board. It's all about money, he explained, pointing to budget allocations for community enhancement that had increased fivefold under Deborah's leadership. When I left, they were sitting on a reserve fund of over $1 million, far more than needed for legitimate maintenance. They're stockpiling cash for something big. That something big became clear when I reviewed the documents more carefully. Hidden in a seemingly routine development proposal was a preliminary agreement with Westview Developers, a luxury real estate company specializing in high-end planned communities. The agreement, signed by Deborah personally, promised delivery of the railroad corridor for a historic train-themed tourist attraction within a new expansion of Sunny Hills. Proposed Railroad Heritage Park would feature boutique shops, upscale dining, and premium residential units, all centered around the restored locomotive. If completed, the development would increase surrounding property values by an estimated 20%, with Deborah's home coincidentally located directly adjacent to the proposed project. If she couldn't deliver the land, she would personally face breach of contract penalties in the six-figure range. This wasn't just about power. It was about survival and profit. Deborah had overcommit and now needed my land at any cost. Armed with this knowledge, I prepared to file a comprehensive lawsuit against the HOA, Deborah personally, and the developer for conspiracy to deprive me of my property rights. Jennifer worked through the weekend drafting the complaint, building a case that included not just the property dispute, but also evidence of harassment, defamation, and tortious interference with business relationships. This is going to make waves, she warned as we reviewed the 40-page document. Once we file this, there's no turning back. Deborah will pull out all the stops to fight us. I nodded, remembering all the people who had shared their stories of intimidation and bullying. I'm ready, I told her. Let's do this. The night before we planned to file, Deborah made her boldest move yet. The local newspaper carried a full-page announcement about Sunny Hills Historic Railroad Park, a new community amenity to be built on what was clearly my property. The glossy advertisement featured artistic renderings of families enjoying ice cream beside the restored locomotive, with construction scheduled to begin in 30 days. The announcement included architectural renderings showing the old train as the centerpiece of a tourist attraction. Even more shocking, I discovered they had actually sent a building permit application to the county with my property address on it. The application had been submitted 3 days earlier with a cover letter claiming all ownership disputes have been resolved and requesting expedited processing. I can't believe they're this brazen, Jennifer said when I showed her, her voice tight with anger. They're literally trying to build on land they don't own. They're counting on bureaucratic confusion and their political connections to push this through before we can stop them. I felt completely drained. With my loan frozen, my reputation under attack, and the HOA proceeding as if they already owned my land, I began to wonder if the fight was worth it. The financial and emotional toll was mounting daily. My savings were dwindling from legal fees and living expenses since I'd originally planned to be living in my new home by now. The constant stress had affected my sleep, my appetite, and my ability to focus on anything else. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and began drafting a letter accepting their purchase offer. Maybe walking away with something was better than losing everything. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I prepared to sign away my grandfather's legacy, but as I hesitated, my eyes fell on the photograph of my grandfather standing beside that old locomotive. This land isn't just dirt and trees, his voice echoed in my memory. With sudden clarity, I tore up the letter, pieces scattering across the table like confetti. I couldn't give up what he had worked so hard to preserve. I don't know what's more ridiculous. I thought a new determination hardening within me, their idea of building a railroad park on my land, or the fact that they sent the permit application to the actual owner of the property. It was time to turn the tables and use their own tactics against them. That train wasn't just blocking my access anymore. It was the key to exposing everything. I knew I needed to inspect that train before Deborah's people could remove or alter anything inside it. Around midnight, I drove to the edge of my property and parked well out of sight. The security guard was there, but dozing in his car with the radio playing softly, moving quietly through the trees. I made my way to the far side of the locomotive where the shadows were deepest. The old train had been parked there for decades, a relic from when the line was still active. It had once been my grandfather's pride and joy, engine 446, a diesel-electric workhorse from the 1950s. I searched the exterior carefully, looking for any sign of the special compartment Franklin had mentioned. In the dim moonlight, I almost missed it, a small metal plate near the engineer's cabin with my grandfather's initials stamped into it. Pressing it revealed a hidden panel that swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. Someone had been maintaining this secret for years. Inside was a waterproof metal box, which I quickly removed and tucked into my backpack. Just as I was closing the panel, a flashlight beam swept across the train. "Hey, who's there?" The security guard called out, suddenly awake and alert. I ducked down and waited until he walked to the other side of the train before making my escape through the underbrush. My heart was pounding as I drove home, the metal box sitting on the passenger seat beside me. Once safely inside my apartment, I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were original documents, the complete land transfer agreement from 1953, showing that my grandfather had purchased the track section outright, not just the adjacent land. More importantly, there was an additional covenant attached to the Sunny Hills Development Lease Agreement with a clause I'd never seen before. My hands shook as I read Clause 14.2a. One paragraph, 73 words. Deborah's empire was built on quicksand, and Granddad had left me the flood. In any case where the ownership rights of the railroad track section are infringed upon, the LOR may terminate the entire area contract by unilateral notice accompanied by verification from the original owner's representative. I immediately called Jennifer and sent her photos of everything. "This is incredible," she said after reviewing them. "This clause essentially gives you the nuclear option. If the HOA infringes on your railroad ownership rights, which they absolutely have by placing guards and barriers there, you have legal grounds to terminate the entire HOA's land lease. That would effectively dissolve the HOA." I sat in stunned silence, finally understanding what my grandfather meant about the contract protecting more than just the land. He had built in a failsafe that could free an entire community from overreach. The next morning, Olivia called with urgent news. "Thomas, I have a source on the inside. Deborah knows about the special clause. There's an email exchange between her and William from 3 months ago discussing the problematic railroad clause and how to make sure you never discovered it. They've known all along that they don't have rights to your property." Her voice dropped lower. And there's more. They're sending a crew to inspect the train today. I think they're planning to remove any evidence. I rushed to my property, arriving just in time to see workers in Sunny Hill's maintenance uniforms surrounding the locomotive. When they spotted me taking photos of them, one worker made a call. Minutes later, William arrived looking uncharacteristically flustered. Mr. Everett, he said, trying to sound authoritative. This is HOA property. You need to leave immediately. I stood my ground. This train and these tracks belong to my family. I have the original documents proving it. William's face hardened. You should understand this isn't a game. People with your stubborn attitude often find themselves facing unexpected troubles. As I walked back to my car, I slipped on loose gravel and fell hard, twisting my ankle. Rather than helping me up, William simply watched with a cold smile before turning away. The message was clear. They were willing to escalate beyond legal maneuvers. Limping back to my vehicle, I realized I had all the evidence needed. Now, I just needed the right stage to expose Deborah and William's deception to the entire community. But with my injured ankle and their security watching my every move, I would need to be strategic about my next steps. I walked into that room with two things: proof of their lies and a secret even Deborah couldn't silence. The Sunny Hills Community Center was packed for the quarterly HOA meeting. Extra chairs had been brought in to accommodate the unusually large turnout, drawn by the announcement that final approval for the historic railroad park would be on the agenda. From my position at the back of the room, I could see Deborah at the front table, looking confident as she called the meeting to order. William sat beside her, shuffling through presentation materials. They had no idea I was there, having told everyone I was out of town dealing with legal troubles. I waited until Deborah reached the agenda item about the railroad park. As you can see from these beautiful renderings, she said, gesturing to a large display board, this project will increase all of our property values and bring charming character to our community. She clicked through slides showing the renovated train as a centerpiece surrounded by boutique shops and cafes. We've already secured the necessary permits, and contractors are ready to begin work next month. That was my cue. I stood up, and with Jennifer and Franklin flanking me, walked down the center aisle toward the podium. The room fell silent as Deborah's smile froze on her face. Mr. Everett, she said tightly, this portion of the meeting is for residents only. I didn't respond to her directly. Instead, I connected my laptop to the projector and began my own presentation. Before you vote on this project, there are some facts you should know, I said, addressing the residents. My first slide showed the original property maps side by side with the altered versions Deborah had been using. The next showed the security footage of me being blocked from my own property, followed by Deborah and William's internal emails discussing the problematic railroad clause they had hidden from everyone. The land they're planning to build on belongs to my family, I explained calmly. Not only that, but the railroad tracks themselves have been owned by my family since 1953. The HOA has been knowingly trespassing and attempting to seize private property through deception. Murmurs spread through the audience as I continued presenting evidence. When I showed the clause that could potentially dissolve the entire HOA, the murmurs turned to gasps. The projector lit up her forged maps. Ask Deborah why she's risking her homes for a developer's paycheck. The crowd erupted. William rushed to the microphone. These are fabricated documents, he declared. Mr. Everett is attempting to extort the HOA with ridiculous threats. Deborah tried to call security to have me removed, but Olivia had been busy live streaming everything to a local community forum. The press is already picking up this story, she announced. Removing Mr. Everett now would only make things worse. Residents began standing up, asking pointed questions about the altered maps and hidden emails. Jennifer took over, explaining the legal ramifications. The HOA board has knowingly violated state property laws, attempted to file fraudulent permits, and misrepresented their authority to all of you. These are serious legal and potentially criminal offenses. As the meeting descended into chaos, Deborah lost her composure. So, what if we knew the land wasn't technically part of the HOA? She shouted, her careful facade cracking. If we don't secure that property, we lose everything. The development deal, the increased property values, all of it. Her voice trembled with a mixture of rage and panic. You don't understand what it's like to have everything taken from you. To watch people with power just walk in and take what's yours. For a moment, I saw the 15-year-old girl watching her family farm being seized and almost felt a flicker of sympathy. Almost. You think you've beaten me? She hissed. I rebuilt myself from nothing. The outburst was caught on dozens of phones. An elderly resident stood up slowly. I've been in Sunny Hills for 30 years, he said. I believed in this HOA, but not this kind of HOA. Others began to stand with him, some holding hastily made signs reading "No more bullying" and "Honest HOA now." William, seeing the tide turning, approached me during a break in the proceedings, voice low and urgent. Let's be reasonable. The HOA is prepared to offer you double the market value for your property. This can all go away. He slid a new contract across the table, this one offering a sum that would solve all my financial worries in an instant. For a brief moment, I considered it. The money would be enough to build my dream home somewhere else, without all this conflict. But then I thought of all the people Deborah had bullied over the years, and I knew what I had to do. I looked William directly in the eyes, remembering all the people who had been intimidated into submission before me. I'm not interested in your money, I replied. I'm interested in justice. The community center was even more crowded 3 days later when we reconvened for a special meeting. News vans parked outside indicated the story had grown beyond our neighborhood. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful as residents spoke openly about years of intimidation and arbitrary rule enforcement. When I took the podium, I laid out my proposal. The HOA must issue a public apology, refund all improper fines collected under Deborah's leadership, and the entire board must resign immediately. In return, I wouldn't pursue further legal action against the individual board members. Deborah, looking exhausted but still defiant, rejected the offer outright. This is absurd. We'll fight this in court for years if necessary. William nodded in agreement, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes. He knew what the documents meant. Jennifer stepped forward with formal legal papers. My client is exercising his rights under Clause 14.2a of the 1953 agreement. As legal representative of the original owner, he is terminating the land lease agreement upon which the Sunny Hills HOA's authority is based. William paled, recognizing the language from his own secret emails. A county hearing was quickly arranged to address the unprecedented situation. In a small courthouse downtown, the county commissioner reviewed all the evidence before making his declaration, based on the documentation presented. It appears the Sunny Hills Homeowners Association has been operating on leased land under conditions that have now been legally terminated. The county can no longer recognize the Sunny Hills HOA as a legal entity. The ruling sent shockwaves through the community and regional real estate world. HOAs had seemed untouchable, yet one hidden clause had brought one down completely. For the final act, I returned to the locomotive that had started it all. With Franklin, Jennifer, and a crowd of supportive neighbors watching, I placed my hand on the old train's side and opened my grandfather's vintage leather briefcase. From it, I removed his Parker fountain pen with his name engraved on the side. One signature, Jennifer said quietly. One legacy, I replied, signing the official notice that would be filed with the county records office. The document terminated the 70-year-old land lease and, with it, the HOA's legal foundation. I stood there next to engine 446, my hand resting on the cool steel in a quiet moment after all the commotion. In that silence, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. Never let them teach you to give up what's rightfully yours. I opened the old leather box he'd kept his railroad spikes in and removed a small section of track tie he'd preserved. I would mount it above the door of my new home, not as a symbol of victory, but as a prompt. Not because I had won, but because he was still here with me, in every inch of railroad track, in every oak tree, in every step that refused to back down. In the aftermath, the community rallied to form a new, more transparent neighborhood association, one with limited powers and democratic processes. The old train was carefully restored and turned into a small railroad museum celebrating the area's history, with a golden plaque reading where justice was once blocked and then rolled forward. I finally began building my home on the land my grandfather had left me, incorporating elements of railroad architecture as a tribute to him. Deborah moved away after facing multiple lawsuits from residents and an investigation into HOA financial mismanagement. William quietly retired to Florida, his reputation in legal circles permanently damaged. I placed a sign at the entrance to my property: no trespassing. Private railroad property. No HOA beyond this point. Olivia wrote an article titled, How One Railroad Engineer's Grandson Derailed a Whole HOA with a Single Clause that won her a Regional Journalism Award. Franklin helped restore the locomotive's engine compartment and occasionally drove it a short distance along the preserved tracks, parking it near my new home as a symbol of family heritage and perseverance. A year later, at the community picnic held on what would have been my grandfather's 100th birthday, a new resident asked me, Do you ever regret dissolving the HOA? It caused so much upheaval. I looked around at the neighbors chatting freely, at children playing without fear of being fined, at gardens blooming in diverse and personal styles. No, I answered, because that HOA didn't collapse because of me. It collapsed when they chose the wrong person to fight against. The legacy my grandfather left wasn't just land or legal clauses. It was the understanding that sometimes standing your ground isn't just for yourself, but for everyone who might come after you. That train still sits on my land. Sometimes I hear its whistle in the wind, a reminder that the past never really dies. And if you ever face a bully like Deborah, look for the rust. The truth is always hiding underneath. As for that train that once blocked my way, it now welcomes me home every day. A reminder that justice may be delayed, but with persistence and the right evidence, it cannot be permanently derailed.